Welcome to Between Authors. I'm your host, author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that book or author that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt for a reader. The goal from my podcast is to bring to you those authors or books that you may never have found, but may be the treasure you've been hunting for all along. Today in episode 47, I bring to you author Ben Schenkman. We're going to go over a little bit about who he is, what he's published, what he's working on, and maybe what his plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Great to be here.
So I'm happy to have you here today. Why don't you begin by giving your introduction to yourself to the viewers?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm a new author to the scene, I guess. I started writing this book quite some time ago, but just recently published. I've kind of an interesting background. I've been doing a lot of different things. I've been in a professional fire dancing troupe for the past 14 years, among various mundane day jobs, but really being an author is something that I've been really digging into for the past year and a half.
Yeah, it's interesting too. The more I do this, the more authors I meet and connect with. It's a unifying thing, right? Being an author and writing, and it really goes back to almost any form of art, right? Whether it's music, writing, painting, poetry, any of that. It's a connection for everybody. It's like a universal language. Yeah, yes, it's not all the same language, but it is a universal language in terms of that connection to the viewer, the reader, the listener, and the connection to whoever created it and what is being put out there, right? And it's an interesting thing I found out with, how unique every author is with their voice, right? Their voice as an author. And it goes back to those individual experiences, right? It goes to the experiences you have, the jobs you've had, or like you said, you're part of a fire dance group. It's all these little things that make your unique voice. And it really goes back to why there does not need to be competition in authors, because nobody's the same. Everyone's voice is so different because you pull from everything you are, right? You pull from your experiences growing up, you pull from your everyday life, you pull from, your work experience, what you enjoy, what you like to listen to, what you like to watch, what you like to read. And that makes you, right? And it's always a shame when you hear that competition, because it doesn't need to be, right? It's just everybody's so unique in their approach.
Well, and frankly, especially for independent and self-published authors, the idea of gatekeeping and competition is really complex when we're responsible for doing every piece of it, from the writing to the editing to the formatting to the marketing, and the marketing being like the worst piece. People think writing a book is hard. Self-promotion is like literal hell.
The marketing is like a job in itself, right? It's like its own full-time employment, is trying to be able to get through the socials and do the marketing and do everything you need to do. It's difficult, but it really goes back to, again, why I do something like this is because I know how much hard work is put into it, right? I know how much we all have to do to be an indie author. And I understand that for all of us, this is a passion project because, for the most part, none of this is paying for any of our bills, right? It's more an expense really than anything coming in to help you. So we're all doing it because we love to do it. And it's something we love doing. And that's something I always want to support, right? And it's a shame sometimes when you do see those ones that don't understand how much is put into that and what it means to each one.
Yep, absolutely agree.
So why don't you give an introduction to the viewers in terms of your influences? What influences you creatively?
It's funny, for this book, which is the first in at least a 3-book series, I would say the biggest influence is life itself, and my own experience. You said that we all have our own story, we all have our own voice that we put into our books, and I think so much of what I write is influenced by my own day-to-day experience. Uh, Nearly every character is one or more facet of a person that I've either met or know very well. You know, the beats, the moments are reflective of things that either I have experienced or want to experience, and it's just so much of it is just like that slice of life that gets tucked into the book. I'll say, as far as like literary influences, I was a huge sci-fi and fantasy reader growing up. I mean, I still am, frankly, but I read a lot of the classic fantasy and sci-fi, and lately I've still been getting into hard sci-fi, as well as other different, slightly different genres.
Yeah.
So I'd say I am obviously influenced by a lot of those. One of my favorite genres is urban fantasy, which is actually it's some books that I just picked up, like authors that I'll talk about, like Charles DeLint is one of my favorites from urban fantasy, and just the way that authors like that write is very real, as far as their characters and their dialogue. So that's a pretty heavy influence. I'll say other influences are things like really good screenwriting, like the writing of Aaron Sorkin on shows like The West Wing. That kind of snappy, funny, witty dialogue is like it's big goals, as far as I would love for my characters to come off as real, but at the same time as, I don't know, not perfect because they're all flawed, but like perfect in that they're a perfect character way.
Yeah. And it is kind of, I'm glad you made that point, because it is interesting. My writing is big from movies, right? I love horror. I love the horror genre and period, but horror movies I've watched since I was a kid, right? And it's a big influence. I write in a way that somebody mentioned when they read my book, that my book could almost easily become a screenplay, because I wrote it almost like you're watching a movie, right? And it goes back against to your influences, as your influence in that way. And that's a good point, right? That the dialogue, the characters, with their flaws but still being real, and those interactions, that would be something that easily connected to the reader, because it's something they are familiar with, right? Something they have experienced, in that, to be in that rhythm, to be in the way that's written. So it is a good point that you bring, and it really goes back to experiences, right? Experiences that you've picked up along the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think I've heard any feedback on this for the book, but like, if you asked me, I would probably say that my books are not like heavy, but like weighted as far as having plenty of dialogue, and that's probably based on those influences of that's the content that I enjoy. I love a good conversation, and having that shown to me. So just like you like a good screenplay, I like a good back and forth conversation, and so that's reflected in our books.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the voice, right? The individual voice of an author, and it's just always so interesting when I have these conversations of those influences, right? The differences. I had one author on the podcast last year, and he had owned a comic book store, and he held D&D games in the store, right? And when he held those games, he would have to come up with a character and a storyline on the spot for the players, right? And he didn't even realize, doing that all those years, when he wrote his book was written in multiple points of view at once, right? So it's almost like when you see the comedian that does all the voice and they're talking to each other, just going back and forth. And it was so comfortable for him, because he hadn't even realized he basically trained himself for that, doing D&D games all those years. And it's like, again, it's all those things you don't even realize sometimes the influence they have on you, or your style, or your writing, or your point of view. And it's just so interesting a lot of times when I hear these, and you hear the different angles it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, it's something that I think I didn't realize until just now. But so I have an undergraduate degree in theater. I don't work in theater, but that's where I got my degree, I've been an actor. And so, like, thinking about stage plays, just like screenplays, are primarily dialogue. So, like, I have to imagine that a lot of the way that I write comes from what I experience and expect. So that's had a
Yeah.
little epiphany on the podcast.
Yeah, it's interesting, really, when you start thinking about it. Sometimes you don't even realize some of those influences, and what an impact they had on you, as you're honing your own voice.
Mhm.
Um, but let's talk about your book, right? I love the title of your book, "My Boss is the Devil." It could be basically a biography of almost everybody's employer. But why don't you give the viewers a little introduction, or summary of what the book's about?
Yeah. So my boss is the devil is it's a little bit of it's a little bit coming of age, and a little bit uh, that kind of escaping a mundane life type of story. It centers around this character Nick, who's a barista, and he's given this once in a lifetime chance to give up his job slinging coffee in a downtown coffee shop and go learn a new skill and work for the devil. The, the twist of it is that the devil in this book isn't necessarily the bad guy, or is he? Uh, Nick gets the opportunity to use influence and power to do what he would normally think of as good deeds, which then makes him wonder whether it's worth selling his soul in order to have this type of influence. So the book centers around that concept. It's an exploration of that kind of good and evil, or do the ends justify the means? But all through it is, what I hope people find as entertaining dialogue, good characters, and there's at least one fluffy cat in the book.
I do love the premise of the story. That sounds like a great, just premise that to be able to work around. And I can imagine the dialogue is actually pretty amazing in those sections that you're writing. Um,
Thank you. Oh, just one more thing. So
yeah.
my books in general are based out of New Haven, Connecticut. So
Okay.
I've lived in New Haven, Connecticut previously. It's where I went to school. It's one of my favorite stomping grounds. So just as far as like the flavor of the book, it's a college town, but it's Yale. So it's not Yale focused. It's pretty much everyman focused, as opposed to the Ivy League. But yeah, it's definitely specific geography, and that's going to carry through with the other books as well.
Okay. Um, Side question, right? So, we talked a little bit before. You're probably talking about this being a trilogy for
Mhm.
the most part. Say you finish that, right? You finish the trilogy, or maybe you go more, whatever, on that side. Going forward, when you do another work or another story, do you feel, and this is sometimes a question I ask on the fantasy side, but do you feel your other stories, if they're city centric or so, maybe still in the same area or same thing, because it is an area you're familiar with, you do love, and you have that I don't want to say emotional attachment, but you have the kind of that umbrella of it that would give you the background for your stories.
No, you're right, and I am emotionally attached to the city. It's a place that I love. I still visit regularly, um, and the short answer is yes. I do intend. So I have plans beyond the current series, whether or not it goes a trilogy or beyond. At a trilogy, I'm pausing this series. So this series with My Boss is the Devil being the first is called the Devil You Know series. So the
Hmm.
Devil You Know is going to stop at 3 books for now. and I'm going to move on to a new concept that I have, but it is still going to be based in New Haven.
Okay. Yeah, I'm always curious about that. It's a big question I ask for usually the fantasy side, because I was like, you've done all of this work to build out these worlds, kind of like the Marvel universe or Star Wars. Do you plan on just keeping that world and completely different stories, characters, but just take advantage of this world you built going forward, right?
Well, it's going to be a different world as far as world building,
Hmm.
just in the same using the same geography, but it is going to be, and I don't know if you want to talk more about this later, but it is going to be more traditional urban fantasy as opposed to like supernatural or occult fiction, which is what My Boss is the Devil is.
Okay, yeah. Well, when we get down to like your future stuff, we'll talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about on that side.
Sure. The
So,
funny thing is, there's a current best-selling author, Lee Bardugo, who's written a couple books that are based in New Haven and specifically around Yale and the secret societies. I think it's funny though. I wrote the draft of this book well before Lee Bardugo was writing in New Haven, so I still feel comfortable keeping that as my place.
uh, that works, right? You definitely had that in there first. Uh, one of the questions I usually like to ask is, do you have a favorite scene in this book?
I think I do, and it's tough. It's like asking. It's like you asking your parents, "Do you have a favorite child?" And the answer
Yeah,
is like, "No, of course but you do. Secretly, you have a favorite scene." Uh,
that's me. I know.
I don't ask. I'm an identical twin, so like it gets complicated asking that question. Uh, so there is a scene, and I can't go too far into it without
Yeah.
spoilers. But Nick gets the opportunity to do something to really help someone, but in doing so, he has to manipulate another person. He takes his influence and he uses it in such a way that he's very good and very effective with it, and he gets the result that he wants, but in the end he hasn't decided whether or not he feels like the good guy anymore. And just the culmination of that scene feels really good, because on top of just like the way that it played out, uh, by the time you get to this point in the book, you're definitely rooting for Nick to 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 have this work out for him. But yeah, I that's probably my favorite scene in the book.
Okay. On the opposite side of it, did you have a hard scene in the book? And hard can mean it was difficult to put together, or you had difficulty kind of getting it where you wanted it to be.
I think the final scene was the most difficult as far as getting it to where I wanted it to be. Uh, it just like any book, you've got different revisions, and uh, the final scene didn't have the right feel to it for a while, and I ended up getting some really good feedback from another author friend of mine that worked with me on kind of fine tuning, especially the ending, and it really made a difference. But the scene itself was kind of hard to like make sure that I was getting to the point where the character had the agency that he needed to make the decisions in a way that made sense.
Yeah. For this book, did you do any specific research for it?
That's a good question, because there's theology associated with my book. Uh, yeah, I didn't do as much research as I could have, because I've taken a fair amount of creative license with it.
Yeah.
There's so much. I mean, I'm going to say mythology around, uh, specifically Christianity in general, because you've got the devil as this figure, and there's so much around it in the, well, he's a fallen angel, but he's a bad guy, but he's not, but he's, and so I felt like as long as I didn't do anything too egregious,
Yeah.
uh, I could play around with it a lot. but there was definitely research that I did as far as like making sure that I was using terminology correctly. Some of the jokes that I tried to make, I ended up scrubbing one joke because I had used a word that I knew in the back of my head. I thought it meant what it did, but on like further revisions, I was like, oh no, that's not even right as far as like the Christian mythology. Like that's so yeah, I've done a fair amount of research as I go to make sure that I'm not just like sticking my foot entirely in my mouth.
Yeah.
Um, but I'll have more to say on that on the future stuff because uh, even for the next books in the series, it's gotten more complicated.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, like
as again, when book 2 and 3 come out, I'd love to have you back and we can go deeper into those books as well. Um, but yeah, it's always I always like asking that question, really for that reason, because if you don't at least know the foundation of what you're talking about, you like you said, you will put your foot in your mouth because somebody will catch it, right? So you always have creative license with it, but you would like to at least have that foundation to build from. So you're not just pulling stuff out of anywhere. That's why I always like asking that question to kind of see what angle the author comes from when they do look up for research for it and then where they take it.
yeah, and the funny thing is, like I say, Christian mythology. Like I was raised Jewish. Uh, I don't know the Bible back and forth, so like I did have to do some looking into it, and like it's like if someone was writing it from a Jewish perspective and tried to use the devil without realizing that that's the New Testament and doesn't exist in the Old Testament. So like you have to make sure that you're not just like, yes, because you're right. Our readers will point at us and be like, oh no, that's very wrong.
Yeah. And it's almost 100% guaranteed that the ones that do know will read your book, right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah,
it's almost guaranteed.
it's like a Murphy's law, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
if you make a mistake, then whoever can recognize it will read your book.
We'll be there. So let's talk about, let's talk about this being a trilogy. So
Mhm.
usually I like to ask what you're currently working on. So we kind of know you're working on book 2 currently and eventually book 3. Um, again, I never want you to give anything away or anything on that side. If there's anything you can kind of give us an idea about maybe where they go or what your plan is for those, again, without giving anything away.
Sure. So I'm working on a lot of different things because I on top. So I wrote the first draft of the second book, and the title of the second book is actually going to be Dueling Shoulder Angels, and that book I wrote the entirety of during last year's National Novel Writing Month. So that was drafted. I've had some beta readers. It's been with an editor and I have that back. So right now I'm just working on incorporating edits, and then that's going to be ready to start going through like the early phases of publishing. So I expect that to be out probably by mid-year.
Okay.
But I'm also now writing, while I'm going through the editing, I'm also writing the draft of the third book. But then while I'm also writing the draft of the third book, I'm working on recording the audiobook for the first book. I don't know how to have less irons in the fire.
That's that seems to be, most of us, the way we do these things are just doing it because you have to, right?
Mhm.
You are you are the one man show usually or one person show, and you do have to do everything. So anything you want to have accomplished, you got to kind of do it, right? And that's what happened. You wind up doing 3 4 things at once. You're editing on your lunch break, and you're going back, and after dinner you're writing book 2. And it's just that's the only way to be able to get through this stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'll say this for any other neurospicy people who are tuning in to the podcast. But having enough things that you can switch regularly to kind of keep that flowing is good, but there is such a thing as having too many. Because once
Yeah.
you have too many, now your brain just doesn't want to do any of it. It's
Yeah.
like, oh no, I now have a fifth thing to do. I guess we'll just do nothing at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And it
Yeah,
goes with anything. Sometimes when you have too many choices, you can't choose, right?
mhm.
It freezes you. But yeah, it is a good point doing the multiple things because you do need those mini breaks sometimes, right? I mean, I heard something recently which I had never heard of, which was called a mood reader. And I'd never heard of that before. And apparently, some readers, I guess, get some form of burnout where they're like, I'm reading. And there's a new thing where some readers have found, and what they're calling it mood reading. But basically, sometimes you'll be reading three books at once, where you have a main one, you may have a Kindle book, you may have an audio book, and as you maybe feel that you're starting to, struggle a little, you pull off of it, go to the other one, and it's at that small break, like taking a power nap or something, that kind of refreshes you for what you're doing. And I understood that. I understood that by, well, like you say, having multiple fires, because you can go to something, your focus goes there. It takes your focus away from this for a moment, and that pulling away is sometimes the reset you need, right? Because as you know, when you're editing, going through, when you just look at something over and over and over again, you just start missing stuff. You're just not going to see anything when you're constantly looking at it. And it's that break, that pull away from your attention and focus that sometimes is all you need. And you come back and you go, wait a minute, I have an idea. This makes sense doing this. And that's why that's great. But yeah, when you got too many, then sometimes you can't choose. I don't know where to start, so I'm not going to start.
Yep. And just to answer your other question, as far as like giving a little bit of flavor as far as what the next books are about, I intended when I started to expand on the mythos as far as the characters being involved. So, the first book focuses on Nick's experience with the devil. The next book, Dueling Shoulder Angels, it's the idea of a duality. The second book introduces a different celestial figure as one of the other characters in the book. And then when we move into the third book, it is kind of expanding the universe a bit as far as, let's just say the third book starts to acknowledge that there are other religions with other pantheons that may or may not also be in the mix. So
Okay.
it's an interesting way to build it. I will also say for folks that enjoy it. So book one has one point of view. I'll say that there is more than one point of view in the second book, which I think will be a very positive development. It's really nice having a second protagonist and their point of view. But again, the second book only has 2 points of view, and then the third book ideally has 3. So it's building up as far as each book goes.
Okay, that sounds great. So we know about the trilogy, and again, I always like to ask the question, like, it's thought of to be a trilogy, but sometimes that doesn't last because as as an author, when you're writing these stories, sometimes they just take a life of their own and go where they want to go. So I always like to ask that question because it may turn out to be more than a trilogy at some point, right? Because as you're writing it, something else may pop up or the story may go away. You're like, okay, yeah, I can go at least one or two more in this round. But like you said, you plan on taking a break from that at the end of the three, again, which is a good idea to kind of reset, right? So, besides what you're currently working on, which is trilogy, I have kind of like a two-part question. What are the ideas? Again, I never want you guys to give away too much, but what are the ideas or story plans you have, say, post trilogy, right? But usually the main question I like to ask is there something future wise you really would like to do at some point as an author, right? And that could be anything from tackling a different genre that you haven't done, tackling, maybe doing fantasy where you're doing the complete world building, or tackling a storyline that you've always thought about and wanted to do, but you haven't really, you know, thought about, plotted it, or really done anything that side. But in the back of your head, at some point, I really, really want to do this.
I, that's a great question. So yeah, just to, I think you had said two parts. I think the first one, as far as I wrote the first book to stand alone originally, and then decided that it needed a sequel and then a third. So the way that I approach the books is that I want you to be able to read each one, yes, in sequence, but when you're done with that one, I want you to feel like there's potential without feeling like you've missed out on something without reading the next book. So yeah, the third book is set up to lead to potential future ones if I decide to go back to it, but taking a break does make sense, and that does let me tackle that other genre. So I mentioned that I really love urban fantasy, and the thing that I want to do next, which frankly I'm already taking notes and doing research for, is a traditional urban fantasy novel. No specific plans for multiple books, because I really just want to write one solid book in that more specific genre first. And it is much more world building and research heavy. I'm taking an existing geography, but I have to decide where all of these things live within it, because it is working in more specific mythology and folklore. Just to give some hints for it, so Connecticut has some really rich indigenous tribes, as far as the indigenous peoples of the area, and I'm taking a spin on urban fantasy that, again, frankly, is similar to what Charles DeLint did in his Newford series, where he took a city in Canada and wove in the indigenous myths of the tribes there into his work. Mine is similar in concept, in that I'm expecting a lot of the indigenous lore. I am not writing from the perspective of an indigenous person. I am not the person to write that perspective. But what I'm trying to do also, for anyone who's thinking about doing things like this, I'm trying to treat the material very respectfully. Like, we as authors have to take creative license, but we have to take creative license in a way that still honors the spirit of the material that we're working with. So I'm reaching out to local tribal councils, museums. I'm trying to get the most reputable books on the tribes of the area as I can, which, frankly, one of the tribes is incredibly hard to find a lot of good information about, because they were never state or federally recognized, though they are the tribe that was indigenous to, like, the exact area that I'm intending to work with. So you have to do your research. Like, I'm planning on taking a trip to the one museum that exists for that tribe in that area, that's open 2 days a month.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's a good point again, right? Because, like you said, you do take creative license, but you do have to honor sometimes those stories, honor the idea of those stories, because that is somebody's culture sometimes, depending on the material, right? But that could be somebody's culture, somebody's history, somebody's challenges in the past, right? So when you do take creative license, but you do want to be truly honest sometimes to those words, those moments, because they do mean a lot to somebody. There is somebody out there that means everything to.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's really what I'm looking to do for the future, is to get into that kind of genre with that writing. Um, Already got my notes going, because while I'm doing all these 5 other things, I'm taking my notes over here like you do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the only way to do it, right? The only way you can do it.
Mhm.
Um, Another quick question for you. Are you the type that plots everything out, or are you hybrid where you plot some and then you just let it flow? And another question I like to ask usually sometimes is, are you a chronological writer, right? Do you have to write that book in order of what the kind of the final is going to be of the book?
Yeah, so I'm the first book I wrote without an outline. No timeline, no nothing. It came out of my brain onto the page, and luckily my brain worked in such a way where it made sense, where it didn't hurt for not having an outline initially.
Yeah.
But since then, for the second and third book, I at least work with a rough outline. And
Yeah.
the rough outline is either grouped chronologically, where it's how I think things are going to flow, or for each of the characters that I'm going to be writing from their perspective, what's happening with them. And it's not a deep outline. A lot of it is like, well, what if this happened to Nick? Like that's the note. It's like, this thing might happen to Nick here. This thing might happen over here. Oh, what about this? And like, I would say, much like the pirate code is rough guidelines, it's a guideline. I don't follow it religiously. I will say though, it's an interesting question, because I do write chronologically. I write in the order that the book is being delivered to the reader, and I don't tend to deviate from that. I think it's just because I'm ordered in that way that I feel like it would hurt to write something later. I will like hit enter 3 times and write a sentence if it comes to me that I know is going to get incorporated later. But
Yeah.
like that's as far as it goes. Like if I have a piece of dialogue or prose that I think is like, really good, I'll write it down. But I don't go and I write that chapter. I just write the snippet and then just try to remember that I have it to plug in later.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm only a couple of books into this in terms of larger works, and I I don't really outline, but I found myself in a way doing it, because what I did is I wound up naming every chapter that I wanted to get through, and that name was like a bullet point for me to know what I wanted that chapter to be, right? So that technically was my outline, even though I didn't structure the thing. I was like, this chapter is going to be called this, but that's all it was a bullet point, right? So I know in this chapter, this is what I wanted to accomplish. So that technically was my outline, but that doing that allowed me to hop around. So I did write completely out of chronological order, because I had some very big scenes that in my mind had to be in the book, and I wrote those first, put them where I knew they belonged in my chapter bullet points, right? And then the bullet points guided me to where that would take that going through, right? So it's probably not the easiest way that I did it, but like you said, it works for you, right? So as you're going through, it keeps you going where you need to go, and that's why I always like to ask that question, because it is interesting to me. Some do plot completely and follow it, some don't. And I always like to hear the different approaches of how an author approaches that.
Well, the challenge, I think, and I think I figured out why I do it, because hearing you talk, I mean, and yes, I'm glad that you acknowledged that was an outline,
Yeah.
because yeah, it sounded like an outline. Uh, but I feel like, to me, I I would have a hard time wanting to deal with not understanding the continuity, and like writing it in order helps me to say, oh no, this can't have happened yet because this thing just happened, or this needs to happen because that just happened. And I feel like it's more comforting to me to not have to worry later about making sure that all of the continuity is good than writing it like that in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. But the biggest takeaway always is the author should go with what they're most comfortable with, right? You go
Absolutely.
with what lets you flow through your story and doesn't hinder or restrict you in any way, because that's when your best work's going to come out.
Yeah, I firmly follow the all words are good words when you're writing your draft. Like, write it in order, out of order, write it a paragraph at a time, whatever it is that you can do. Like, words on page is the progress. So yeah, however it is that you need to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just very interesting. I always like thinking about that because it did help in a way, because when I did do them out of order, I found myself when I wrote through, say, that chapter or that scene or whatever, it gave me other stuff, right? It told me, okay, this could be why this happened. And as you're writing that, you start putting those little, those little nuggets, those little morsels that will tie back to something, because you're like, okay, I understand kind of why this would happen. And that helps feed that, rather than going the other way where you're hoping you have the morsels to get you to the story later. And then sometimes you go and, so you're still connecting it, and it's doing a reverse connection rather than going forward. But it's just interesting. It's interesting to me, how everybody approaches it, how they come at it, because all of it is valid, right? There, like you said, there is no right or wrong way. Getting the words on the page, getting your voice on the page, it's all valid, right? And it's just interesting to me though when I do. I love that part of it, to hear how an author comes up with it. I love, like I said before, their influences of what gave them that voice, and things that they may not even realize really influenced them until they really start thinking about it. But it's always an interesting conversation looking at that from that angle. So I do, like I said, I do definitely want to have you back on when you have your other book out, so we can discuss that. You can go a little more in depth into what's going on in that book, and give a little more detail into what's happening. But I really do want to, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate you coming on, getting your work out there for others to be able to find it and check it out. I will leave down below in the description all the links for the viewers, just so you know, all the links for Ben in terms of his website, links for the books, socials, whatever he wants to include in there. And definitely, if you have any questions for either Ben or myself, shoot them to us. If you want to know anything more about what we discussed, or just have any questions in general, we'd love to see those. And definitely don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications so you don't miss all these amazing, talented authors that I have coming up. Thank you again, Ben. I really did enjoy this. I love the conversation. I'm really happy I had John today.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It's been a blast. Also love the conversations, and I would be very happy to come back after I've got my second book out, because it definitely has some good twists in it that I would love to discuss once it's out.
Yeah, absolutely. When you get the that release date and we get closer, we'll start discussing that, so we can, sometimes I like to, if I can, because I pre-record these. Sometimes I like to tie in, like when the episode was there, close enough as I could to your release, right? So you kind of have somewhat of a small marketing tool to help you as your book comes out. So, we'll discuss that to see when that comes, and see how we would be able to plan that, to kind of match that up. But yeah, I absolutely loved having you on, and I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian.
Yeah. Thank you, viewers, as well. Goodbye.